Hey everybody, it's Jamie. With last night's by-elections, Carney has finally inched his way to a majority government. But after 5 floor crossers joined the Liberals, spanning from the NDP to the social conservative wing of the Conservative Party, there are questions around what exactly that government stands for. And even people within the Liberal Party have been questioning the decision to bring the latest MP, Marilyn Gladu, into the fold. So today, I am going to talk to CBC senior parliamentary writer Aaron Wary about what Mark Carney's big tent looks like and how a majority will change things for the Liberals. Aaron, hello.
Hey.
Good to have you. We are recording Monday night. It's around 10:15 Eastern, and 2 of the 3 ridings have been called now by the CBC, and they've been called for the Liberals. So that pushes them one over a majority to 173.
The Liberals winning seats in Toronto's University Rosedale and Scarborough Southwest, both long considered safe seats for the party.
Terrebonne still hasn't been called in Quebec. Any surprises so far?
No, not at all. The 2 Toronto area ridings, Scarborough Southwest and University Rosedale, were pretty much safe Liberal seats. Would have been a real shock if they hadn't won it. And Terrebonne is, as expected, given the result we saw last year, is going to be close and will be probably several more hours yet before it's decided.
Tell me a little bit about these new MPs that we know are now coming to Parliament. So Dolly Begum and Danielle Martin.
Yeah, Danielle Martin's a very prominent doctor, media commentator on healthcare issues.
As of tonight, Mark Carney and our entire incredible Liberal team have earned an even more powerful mandate to continue building a better Canada.
Has been fairly prominent, over the last several years. You can kind of imagine someone like her having a fairly prominent role in the Liberal government going forward. Maybe not a cabinet minister right away, but conceivably at some point. Dolly Begum is an interesting candidate in Scarborough Southwest. She was the former deputy leader of the Ontario NDP. Not exactly a floor crosser because she's, changing political levels, but another kind of wrinkle to the big tent that Mark Carney is putting together.
Tonight, we celebrate something so powerful. Not just as an incredible campaign, but a community coming together, putting aside their differences to choose hope, compassion, and progress. Tonight, we celebrate a new beginning.
So, as we've discussed, this result is not really a surprise, especially after news last week that Marilyn Gladu became the 5th MP to cross the floor.
It is a great pleasure to welcome Marilyn Gladu to, and we'll do it officially.
Yes.
So this is a handshake in English, officially to the government caucus.
And I want to talk about Gladu a little bit more with you here. She has been a Conservative MP since 2015 and is generally seen as part of the socially conservative wing of the party. We had a conversation yesterday that touched on what that means for the Conservatives. Spoiler alert, her departure is bad for them. But talk to me a bit about what you think it means for the Liberals, beyond getting them to that majority, to attract someone considered very right on the political spectrum on at least social issues.
Yeah, I don't know that Marilyn Gladu would have been the last Conservative MP I would have ever imagined crossing over to the Liberals, but she would have been closer to the bottom than the front.
Gladu opposed legalizing cannabis,
The doubling of traffic deaths, and Liberals don't care.
voted against banning conversion therapy, was forced to apologize for questioning the seriousness of COVID-19 and the need for vaccine mandates. Gladu also said during her leadership bid she'd allow private member bills to restrict abortion.
At the same time, she's also been celebrated for being able to work across the aisle and has been, considered one of the more collegial MPs in the House of Commons. If you were in Montreal this weekend, like I was for the Liberal convention, and you talked to Liberals there, I don't know that any of them were, drawing a line in the sand and saying, I can't be in a party with Marilyn Gladu, but they were definitely sort of furrowing their brow and wondering, does this make sense? I'm not quite sure about this. Not quite sure where this is going. They introduced her to the convention the one night. There was applause. It didn't, to my ear, sound super enthusiastic.
Bonsoir, Montréal, et bonsoir, chers libéraux.
Unlike the previous floor crossers, who you could say, well, yes, they were conservatives, but they, ran in ridings where the Liberals finished a close second, or, maybe they were more on the progressive conservative side themselves. This move kind of defies those previous ideas. This isn't a riding that it looks like the Liberals would be likely to win. And I don't think Marilyn Gladu has ever really been considered a progressive conservative.
Getting to this majority, it came because of this very unique coalition, right, that they've been able to put together, including Dolly Begum now. You said she's previously a provincial member of parliament for the Ontario NDP, and Laurie Idlott, who came from the NDP as well. Avi Lewis, the new leader of the NDP, has said that Carney's political tent is the whole spectrum. And on yesterday's show, Toronto Star Ottawa Bureau Chief Tonda McCharles talked about how some are seeing this draw to the Liberal Party as a kind of anti-Trump coalition. And I just wonder what you think of describing it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea.
And so we need a serious leader who can address the uncertainty that has arrived due to the unjustified American tariffs. We need a global leader with a plan to make a more resilient Canada, a stronger Canada, a more self-reliant Canada for this critical moment.
First, we should take a step back and realize that, if you go back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, it was not at all uncommon for there to be social conservatives within the Liberal Party. There were a number of MPs who had socially conservative views. This came up on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion, and it really wasn't until Justin Trudeau became leader and said this Liberal Party is going to be pro-choice resolutely that the party really kind of drew a line on that. So I think to a certain extent, you can look at it and say, well, this is the Liberal Party getting back to the way it was pre-Justin Trudeau. But I think this idea of an anti-Trump coalition, I think, is an interesting way of looking at it, insofar as it kind of speaks to, I think, this really unique moment and this really unique majority that Mark Carney has put together. We really haven't had a situation like this where a party came close to winning a majority and then was able to piece it together largely through floor crossings, and not just some floor crossings, but floor crossings from two different parties. And if there is something that unites all of these people together, in addition to whatever kind of big tent the Liberal Party is capable of being, it may be this idea of implementing this agenda in the face of the threat posed by Donald Trump.
Sources in the Liberal Party told some of our colleagues that the party is in talks with 9 other MPs about crossing the floor. I know a lot of political types have been saying in recent days that if they were going to cross, it would come after these by-elections. Why? Why wait?
So first of all, I guess I should say, I don't know that the Liberals have a bunch of floor crossers sitting in their back pocket that they're waiting to play in the next few days. That said, I think there is some logic to, if there were people who are ready to cross the floor, maybe you wait, because tonight they can say, well, we got to a majority, we got to 172, we got to 173 because of these by-elections, not directly because of the floor crossers. And look, there's an obvious rejoinder to that, which is these are safe Liberal seats that they were going to have anyway. And really the difference between the result they have now and the result they had 12 months ago is those floor crossers. But I think just for symbolic reasons, for one night, you want to be able to say, look, the voters have given us this majority. We haven't just used floor crossers to get there.
Now that they've passed into this majority territory, what would, if not 9, even just a couple more MPs mean for them?
Yeah, I think it matters, because as much as they have obviously gotten to a majority, 173, you're going to hear the word narrow a lot over the next few days. And it really is, because we know from, previous parliaments that there are always resignations, there are always people deciding to move on to different jobs. MPs get into trouble, things happen essentially. And if you are at 173, then you really can't afford to lose one or two MPs at a time. And we already know Nate Erskine-Smith, the current Liberal MP for Beaches East York, is planning to run provincially. So there's a
Hmm.
resignation you can sort of count on. They really probably, to be comfortable, would want at least a couple more seats, because then they can afford to lose a couple people, over the next few years.
We talked on yesterday's show about Pierre Poilievre's future. There are reports, of course, that on top of the floor crossers and defectors, 40 MPs are concerned about losing their seats. And a few are even talking about trying to force him out right now. We now have these results. And there is a Conservative caucus meeting on Wednesday. The fact that Carney has a majority government must feel very real right now, right, to Conservatives. And what have you heard about how consequential this caucus meeting on Wednesday could be?
I mean, I think it's hard to know exactly where the Conservative caucus is going to go now. The Star did have that story that said, 40 Conservative MPs are worried about their seats. I think that's very plausible. I mean, if you just look at the seat projections based on where the polls are right now, the Conservatives would lose, about 40 MPs. It's hard to know how exactly they're going to react to this, especially because if you go back a few months, every time there was a new floor crossing, people would kind of speculate that, oh, this is going to be the tipping point for Pierre Poilievre. And yet we haven't really seen a concerted push against him from within caucus. There's no sort of alternative leader stepping forward. And so I'm a bit hesitant to say, oh, this could be the end. I do think he and the Conservatives are now looking at another 3 years in opposition.
Hmm.
Even if that doesn't sort of psychologically affect them right now, that's 3 years that he has to kind of hang in there. And it's hard to know exactly how that's going to work out. That's a long time to be sitting in opposition, and it just adds to the amount of time he's going to have to kind of hold on. I mean, you can sort of look at this the other way and say, well, Pierre Poilievre doesn't want an election right now. And so to a certain extent, this serves him in giving, taking the threat of an election off the table and potentially giving him time to, burnish his own image, or time, more importantly, for Mark Carney to accumulate political baggage, for some of the shine to come off of Mark Carney. But the flip side of that, I think, would be, what if another year from now, the polls are what they are? Do Conservative MPs at that point decide, well, we need to make a change? Do Conservative MPs look at these 3 years and say, okay, now we've got time to make a change
Hmm.
at,
Right.
at a new leader? It's really hard to know how this is all going to kind of play out within that caucus.
Yeah. Are they thinking we got to do it now? Maybe even as an attempt to try and stop more people from crossing, potentially. I've certainly been seeing a couple of Conservatives kind of publicly pledging their support for Poilievre and for the party. For example, Brad Redekop, Saskatchewan MP, posted today, "I will never cross the floor and betray the 52.48% of voters who place their trust in me and Pierre Poilievre's leadership." I just do you see those messages as evidence that there is a lot of support inside the Conservative Party for its leader?
I mean, I think you can sort of take it one of two ways. You can look at it and say, well, these MPs are standing by Pierre Poilievre. They're publicly pledging their support for him. They're, adding to the idea that these other MPs have sort of betrayed their constituents, which is this argument the Conservatives are trying to make. I mean, I think the flip side of that is, you're maybe not in a great place when your MPs have to publicly pledge their support for you.
Hmm.
It's a bit reminiscent of what Justin Trudeau went through,
Yeah.
and all of the sort of public back and forth over that, and it didn't end well for Justin Trudeau. I think there's a real challenge in front of Pierre Poilievre to sort of get through this.
Speaking of Trudeau, I couldn't help but notice tonight that the riding that ultimately gave Carney the majority was University Rosedale, which was Chrystia Freeland's old writing. Like it's just an interesting narrative considering
It's
that
poetic.
Freeland essentially kind of set all of this in motion. Okay, let's talk about the Liberals a little bit more. This is their first majority since 2019, but also just the third majority in the last 20 years, right? It's actually a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I think the last few decades, really, in Canadian federal politics, have shown that getting to a majority is going to be hard now, and the minority governments are really going to be the norm. So to have gotten to this spot for Mark Carney is a really pretty remarkable achievement. I don't think it's all easy going from here on in. I don't know that he can necessarily rest on his laurels, but you really can't understate or really can't overstate what an accomplishment this is for him.
What practical difference is this going to make for the way that they govern?
All sorts of ways. Once you have a majority in the House of Commons, you do have tools at your disposal to move legislation forward. You can, use something called time allocation to cap debate if the opposition was refusing to let things move forward. The ability to get legislation through the House is suddenly much improved. And then there's just the basics. You're going to survive a
Mhm,
confidence vote. You can
mhm.
start to plan for, maybe being in office for 3 years. The difference between 171 seats and 173 seats is really big.
Mhm. Is there any legislation or any part of their agenda that you think might go forward now that they don't have to worry about courting opposition members for votes?
I mean, there are bits and pieces on lawful access. I wouldn't be surprised if when it comes to online harms, whether they have a slightly easier time, obviously getting legislation through. As much as they don't have to worry about the opposition anymore, I don't know that they would be well advised to say, we no longer need to even bother listening to what the people on the other side or what our critics are saying. We can just plow forward.
Mhm.
Uh, because I think to a certain extent, Mark Carney's image and his popularity has been built on being pragmatic and not being super partisan. And we've seen this government move legislation forward where there has been blowback and there have been people saying you're going too far, you need to dial it back. And they've had to dial it back in some cases because of opposition. Just because they don't have to worry about the opposition anymore, they would probably still be well advised to listen to some of those complaints.
When have they had to do that?
Well, you've seen it a few times, like the major projects office legislation. There were
Mhm.
concerns that it was going too far. There was some legislation on a lawful access that they had to dial back a bit. There was some legislation on some regulatory changes they wanted to
Mhm.
make, to make it easier for innovators that they've had to dial back. And I think there's some risk here. We've talked about this in the past that the conservatives are going to be primed now to look at the liberals and point to any evidence they can of them sort of running roughshod over parliament, of them moving too fast or ignoring opposition. And I think the liberals, to some extent, still have to be mindful of that.
Mhm. I remember you were on this show a while back and we were talking through some of the risks of a majority. And one of the risks that you mentioned too is that backbench Liberal MPs could find themselves holding an immense amount of power. And have you seen any indication that the Carney government is aware of those risks?
I think we're still waiting to see how that sort of manifests itself. Uh,
Hmm.
if you go back to, for instance, the outbreak of hostilities in Iran, the American attacks on Iran, the pushback against that really came from a liberal backbencher named Will Greaves, who came out and criticized Mark Carney's initial statement. Going back even further, there was some massive machinations around a liberal climate caucus sort of taking shape. You've seen Stephen Guilbeault criticize the liberal climate record. We haven't yet really see it kind of come to a head and really force the government's hand on things. But I do think the Carney government has to be mindful of it. And I guess if you were looking for signs that he is mindful of it, you might look at his convention speech on the
Mm.
weekend, where he spent a lot of time talking about former Liberal prime ministers and liberal values and praising liberal values and celebrating liberal values.
Where women always have the right to choose. Where you can believe what you want to believe. Where you can love who you want to love. Where everyone can be their entire selves and all have a chance to thrive.
And it really felt like a speech in the wake of Marilyn Gladu's arrival that was really about trying to convince liberals that Mark Carney was a liberal and reassure them of that. So I think that may be some hint that the Carney liberals know they need to be mindful of that, whether or not the liberal backbench is going to try to use its power going forward. I think that remains to be seen.
Hmm. That convention, what would you say came out of that in terms of their vision and priorities for the year ahead?
I think it's hard to know, particularly on the idea of whether a majority is going to change them somehow. There wasn't, and I guess you have to understand it, there wasn't going to be, he wasn't going to give a speech on the weekend that said, pretty soon I will have my majority and here's what I will do with it. It was really a statement about what they've already been doing and kind of reinforcing Mark Carney's idea of needing to move fast and make changes and do things in response to uh, the rupture that he believes has occurred.
Hmm.
And so, you could listen to that speech and say, well, he's really just going to kind of carry on doing what he's been doing. But I think inevitably there's going to be some temptation to use the majority that he has. And I think to a certain extent, Mark Carney wasn't elected on a sort of itemized list of 300 things he was going to do over 4 years. He was sort of elected over a general idea that he was the right guy to respond to Donald Trump. And I
Hmm.
think that creates a bit more sort of openness to maybe do things that he didn't talk about in the platform. And so I think that'll be interesting to see whether, as he kind of fills out his agenda, what it looks like, and whether, now that he has a majority, it gets maybe even more aggressive.
Right. But as we've been talking about, this is also the reason why people think he's got the majority now, because he's been able to make this coalition on that same question, right? On how to deal with our neighbors to the south. I guess I just wonder, and it doesn't really seem like it's going to happen anytime soon, but what happens to this coalition if things calm down with Trump?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first question would be, will things calm down?
Yeah.
And the second part of that is, yeah, I do think there is a question of how this all holds together. Like, yes, okay, there is a unifying idea that they're all there to respond to the threat posed by Donald Trump in the United States political situation writ large. But there are inevitably going to be things they don't all agree on. So, how does Mark Carney hold them together? How does he, keep caucus happy, on just a human level, dealing with them? How does he, deal with disagreements within caucus? One of the things that I think has kind of distinguished, or seems to be distinguishing, the Carney government from the Trudeau government is that the Trudeau government kind of operated on this basis of trying to minimize potential problems ahead of time. Lots of consultation, lots of thinking, lots of talking to, stakeholders, and then acting. And the
Mm.
Carney government seems to operate more on acting and then cleaning up any messes after that.
Hmm.
So I don't know how that sort of model, whether that model will work if he's trying to hold all of these people together. He might have to sort of go back to kind of consulting ahead of time and making sure he's got all 172 or 173 other Liberal MPs behind him.
I know we've done this a couple times throughout the year, but just to like take a moment and kind of marvel at where we are right now. I remember it was like almost a year ago now that we had that election, and we were like recording this pod really late. The Liberals had a strong minority then, and we went back and we were looking at our headline from that night about a year ago, and it was Carney wins a country divided. And I think that is what we saw that night. It was, of course, this extraordinary comeback for the Liberals, but also basically a two-horse race that split the country into two between the Conservatives and the Liberals. Polling now shows that if there was an election now, the Liberals could get, 200 seats? Aaron, is that the latest polling?
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah. So if last year what we were looking at was a country in many ways divided, how would you describe this moment that we're in right now?
I think it's Carney's moment. The idea that the country is divided has fallen away a bit, although I think there's still something to that. I think there are still people who are, yes, concerned about Donald Trump, but are as much, if not more, concerned about the cost of housing and inflation and the price of groceries. But I think there is much more public goodwill now, clearly behind Mark Carney. You can see that in his own personal approval numbers. You can see that in the approval for the government. You can see it in the floor crossings from both the Conservatives and the New Democrats. This isn't quite a national unity government, but it has stitched together a fair bit of unity behind it. And I think now even more so because he has a majority, because the Liberals have a majority, the question is how well Mark Carney rises to the moment and how well he fulfills the promise of being the guy to respond to this moment. Because I think he's obviously done well on the international stage and reassuring Canadians in that sense. I think it remains to be seen how he's doing or how he will do on housing and cost of living issues. And I think those are still their biggest vulnerabilities. But it's been an incredible 16 months for him. And now he has 3 years to try to make good on it.
I would be remiss to say I know you're saying that this is Carney's moment, but I mean, Trudeau did get to spend the weekend in Coachella with his girlfriend wearing a backwards hat and drinking from a red Solo cup. So I just feel like I should ask the question, really, whose moment is it right now?
Yeah, really, look, 16 months ago, the Liberals were doomed. Justin Trudeau was getting booted out. Now Mark Carney has a Liberal majority. Justin Trudeau's getting to hang out at Coachella. It's a win-win, I think, for both sides. It's hard to say who had a better weekend, Mark Carney or Justin Trudeau, but I think they're probably both pretty happy with it.
I agree. Aaron, thank you.
Anytime.
All right, that is all for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.